Attendant refuses black child's request for water 4 times, not knowing his mother just bought the airline. The tension in the air was as thick as the humidity outside the aircraft windows. 10-year-old Marcus Jefferson's tongue felt like sandpaper as he pressed the call button for the 4th time. His throat ached, parched from the recycled cabin air and the anxiety of flying alone in first class for the first time. The flight attendant, Stephanie Winters according to her gleaming name tag, approached with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. As she leaned toward Marcus, her perfume, something expensive and floral, wafted over him. Yes, her tone was clipped, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to strain against her scalp. "May I please have some water?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the drone of the engines. He straightened his shoulders, remembering his mother's advice about speaking clearly and with conviction. Stephanie's gaze flickered over him, then to the empty seat beside him. Her smile tightened. "I'll be with you shortly," she said, then turned away, her attention already diverted to an older white gentleman 3 rows ahead who had just raised his hand. Marcus watched as she promptly delivered a scotch on the rocks to the man, exchanging pleasantries and laughing at something he said. She then attended to 2 other passengers, refilling their drinks, providing extra pillows, all while managing to avoid making eye contact with Marcus. His call button remained the only one illuminated on the overhead panel. What Marcus couldn't know was that at that exact moment, in a sleek conference room 50 stories above Manhattan, his mother, Diana Jefferson, was signing the final paperwork on her acquisition of Meridian Airlines, the very carrier on which her son was currently being ignored. 24 hours earlier, Diana Jefferson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over New York. At 43, she had built Jefferson Capital from a small investment firm into one of the most formidable private equity companies on the East Coast. Her latest acquisition, Meridian Airlines, was not just another business move, it was personal. "The board has accepted our final offer," said Michael Chen, her chief financial officer, as he placed a thick folder on her glass desk. "We'll be the majority shareholders by this time tomorrow." Diana nodded, her reflection in the window showing a woman of striking presence, tall, with flawless dark skin and eyes that seemed to calculate a dozen moves ahead. "And they still have no idea it's us." "No, we've worked through the shell corporations as planned. As far as they know, it's a standard private equity acquisition." Diana turned from the window, her tailored navy suit a sharp contrast to the cream-colored office. "Good. I want to be very clear, Michael. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability." Michael, who had worked with Diana for 15 years, knew better than to question her motives. He'd been there 6 years ago when Diana and 10-year-old Marcus had been removed from a Meridian flight after a flight attendant had accused Marcus of behaving disruptively, when he'd simply been asking for a glass of water. He'd witnessed Diana's restraint as she filed complaint after complaint, only to be met with form letters and corporate deflection. "The closing documents will be ready for your signature tomorrow morning," Michael said, "and I've arranged for Marcus's flight back from Chicago on Meridian first class, as you requested." Diana's expression softened at the mention of her son. "Thank you. His debate tournament ends at noon, so the 3:30 flight should be perfect." She paused, fingering the small, worn photo she kept on her desk, Marcus at 4, gap-toothed and beaming. "He's grown so much since then, but some wounds don't heal with time." Michael nodded, understanding the layers of meaning in her words. "Will you tell him about the acquisition?" Diana smiled, a plan clearly formulating behind her eyes. "Not yet. Let's see how Meridian handles having a Jefferson on board first." Back on Meridian Flight 2837 from Chicago to New York, Marcus Jefferson was trying not to cry. He was 10 years old, double digits, as his mother liked to say, and crying was for babies. But his throat was so dry it hurt to swallow, and the flight attendant had ignored him 4 times now. He glanced at his digital watch, a birthday gift from his mother, and saw that they'd been in the air for 45 minutes. In the aisle seat next to him, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes looked up from his book. Harold Baker had been observing the situation develop with growing concern. He'd watched as the boy had politely requested water multiple times, only to be overlooked while other passengers received prompt service. "Is everything all right, young man?" Harold asked, his voice gentle. Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. I've been trying to get some water, but... His voice trailed off, not wanting to complain. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly as he observed Stephanie efficiently serving other passengers while continuously bypassing their row. With a discreet nod, he pressed his own call button. Stephanie appeared almost immediately. Yes, sir, how can I help you? Her smile was warm, attentive. The young man here has been trying to get some water, Harold said, his tone conversational but firm. Would you mind bringing him a glass, please, and perhaps some for me as well? A flash of something, annoyance, embarrassment, crossed Stephanie's face before her professional mask slipped back into place. Of course, sir, right away. As she walked away, Harold turned to Marcus. I'm Harold, by the way. Marcus, the boy replied, relief evident in his voice. Thank you, sir. No need to thank me, Harold said, marking his place in his book, a dog-eared copy of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, Marcus noted. Everyone deserves common courtesy. When Stephanie returned with 2 glasses of water on a small tray, she placed them on the armrests without a word and quickly moved on to other passengers. Marcus drank his water in grateful gulps while Harold watched, his expression thoughtful. Are you traveling alone, Marcus? Marcus nodded. Yes, sir. I was at the National Junior Debate Tournament in Chicago. My mom will pick me up in New York. Harold's eyebrows rose, impressed. National debate, eh? That's quite an achievement. The boy smiled shyly. I made it to the semifinals. That's outstanding, Harold said sincerely. What was the debate topic? Equal protection under the law, Marcus replied, sitting a little straighter. My argument focused on how implicit bias affects enforcement. Harold chuckled, but it was warm, not condescending. Pretty advanced thinking for someone your age. Marcus shrugged. My mom says understanding these things early might help me navigate the world better. He paused, then added more quietly, she would know. Harold's expression grew more serious. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is, Marcus said proudly. She says knowledge is power, but understanding is freedom. As they continued to talk, neither noticed Stephanie watching them from the galley, her expression unreadable as she spoke in low tones to another flight attendant, Raj Patel, whose concerned frown deepened as she whispered something in his ear. Meanwhile in New York, Diana Jefferson sat in the back of her company car as it glided through midtown traffic. The acquisition papers had been signed that morning, and she was now officially the majority owner of Meridian Airlines. She should have been reviewing the quarterly projections on her tablet, but instead, she found herself staring at the tracking app that showed Marcus's flight progress. 30 minutes until landing. Her phone rang, Thomas Whitfield, the now former CEO of Meridian, who had just been informed of the identity of his company's new owner. Diana, he began without preamble, his voice strained with forced cordiality. This is unexpected. Is it, Thomas? She replied, her tone cool but not hostile. I would have thought after our previous interactions that you might have anticipated my interest in your company. There was a pause on the line. If this is about what happened 6 years ago. This is about business, Thomas, Diana interrupted smoothly. Meridian has potential that your leadership hasn't fully realized. But yes, my personal experience as a customer did inform my assessment of the company's customer service deficiencies. She could almost hear him calculating his response, weighing what he knew about her reputation for both business acumen and uncompromising principles. I assume you have changes in mind, he finally said. Indeed I do. The first being that you'll be meeting me at the gate when my son's flight lands. Flight 2837 from Chicago. He's flying alone, and I want to ensure he's treated with the appropriate care and respect. Another pause, longer this time. Of course, I'll be there personally. Good, Diana said. And Thomas, consider this a test. How my son is treated for the remainder of his flight will determine much about how I approach the transition of leadership. She ended the call and took a deep breath, centering herself. This wasn't just about Marcus or even about what had happened years ago. It was about setting the tone for the culture she intended to build, one where everyone was treated with dignity, regardless of age or color. She had fought too hard and risen too high to settle for anything less. Her driver caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Everything all right, Miss Jefferson? Diana smiled, the determination evident in her eyes. Everything is proceeding exactly as it should, Robert. Let's head to the airport, please. On the plane, the atmosphere in first class had shifted subtly. Marcus had finally received his water, but he couldn't help noticing that Stephanie seemed to be watching him more closely now, though she continued to avoid direct interaction. Instead, another flight attendant, Raj, had begun checking on him periodically, offering snacks and refills with a genuine smile. Harold had returned to his book, but occasionally engaged Marcus in conversation about school, debates, and books they both enjoyed. Marcus found himself relaxing for the first time since boarding, the initial discomfort fading though not forgotten. "So what does your mother do?" Harold asked during one of these exchanges. "She's in business," Marcus replied, the pride evident in his voice. "She runs her own company." "That's impressive," Harold said. "What kind of business?" Marcus hesitated, remembering his mother's lessons about privacy and discretion. "Investment stuff. She buys companies and makes them better." Harold nodded, understanding the boy's careful answer. "My late wife was in finance too, taught me that money is just a tool. It's what you build with it that matters." Before Marcus could respond, the plane encountered turbulence, causing drinks to slosh and passengers to grip their armrests. The captain's voice came over the intercom, requesting that flight attendants take their seats for the remainder of the flight. Stephanie, who had been serving in the galley, quickly made her way down the aisle, checking that seatbelts were fastened. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused, seeming to steel herself before addressing him directly for the first time since her initial dismissal. "Is your seatbelt fastened securely?" she asked, her tone professional but distant. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied politely. She nodded and moved to continue down the aisle, but Harold's voice stopped her. "Excuse me," he said, his tone pleasant but firm. "I believe the young man could use another glass of water before landing. The air is quite dry." Stephanie's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, sir, but the captain has asked us to be seated due to turbulence." "Of course, safety first," Harold replied reasonably. "Perhaps once the turbulence passes." "Certainly," she said, though her expression suggested she was hoping to avoid it. As she moved away, Harold looked at Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I've been flying this airline for 20 years, and I've noticed that some staff seem to have trouble seeing certain passengers clearly." Marcus nodded, understanding the subtext. "My mom says that sometimes people's vision is clouded by what they expect to see rather than what's actually there." Harold smiled, impressed. "Your mother is absolutely right, and what do you think about that?" The boy considered the question carefully. "I think, it's sad for them, they miss a lot that way." Harold's smile deepened, touched by the compassion in the young boy's perspective. "That's a remarkably generous view, Marcus. Many adults never reach that level of understanding." The turbulence subsided, but Stephanie did not return with water. Instead, Raj appeared, carrying 2 glasses. "Thought you gentlemen might be thirsty," he said with a warm smile. "We'll be beginning our descent into New York shortly." As Raj moved away, Marcus noticed Stephanie watching from the galley, her expression now troubled as she conferred with a third flight attendant, Kelly, a middle-aged black woman who kept glancing in Marcus's direction with growing concern. The plane began its descent into New York, the sprawling cityscape coming into view through the windows. Marcus felt a flutter of excitement at the thought of seeing his mother soon and telling her about the debate tournament. Despite the uncomfortable beginning to the flight, he felt he had handled himself well, just as she had taught him. Little did he know that his experience on this flight was about to become much more significant than he could imagine. At JFK Airport, Diana Jefferson stood near the arrivals board, outwardly calm but internally counting the minutes until Marcus's flight landed. Beside her, looking considerably less composed, was Thomas Whitfield, the CEO of Meridian Airlines, at least for now. "The flight is on time," Diana observed, checking her watch. "That's a good start." "Ms. Jefferson," Thomas began, clearly attempting to establish a rapport, "I want to assure you that what happened 6 years ago was an anomaly. Meridian prides itself on customer service for all passengers." Diana turned to face him directly, her gaze unwavering. Is that so? Then perhaps you can explain why complaints of discriminatory treatment are filed at a rate 63% higher against Meridian than the industry average, or why those complaints are resolved satisfactorily at a rate 42% lower. Thomas blinked, clearly surprised by her specific knowledge of his company's metrics. I wasn't aware the numbers were quite that stark. That's precisely the problem, isn't it? Diana said, her voice level but intense. When leadership isn't aware or chooses not to be aware, the culture reflects that blindness. Before Thomas could respond, Diana's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, then back at Thomas with a slight smile. That was my assistant. Your board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They seem rather concerned about the change in ownership. Thomas's jaw tightened, as would be expected with any major transition. Indeed, Diana agreed smoothly. Change can be difficult, but sometimes it's necessary for growth. She nodded toward the arrivals board. The flight has landed. Shall we proceed to the gate? As they walked, Diana maintained a professional distance from Thomas, her mind already mapping out the changes she planned to implement. This wasn't just about making a point. It was about creating lasting change in a company culture that had allowed discrimination to persist unchecked. They arrived at the gate just as the first passengers began to emerge from the jetway. Diana scanned the crowd, looking for her son among the stream of business travelers and families. When she finally spotted him walking alongside an older white gentleman, deep in conversation, her heart swelled with pride and relief. Marcus saw his mother at almost the same moment, and his face lit up. He quickened his pace, nearly running the last few steps to embrace her. "Mom," he exclaimed as Diana wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "There's my debate champion," she said warmly, pulling back to look at him. "How was your flight?" Before Marcus could answer, Harold approached, a kind smile on his face. "You must be Marcus's mother," he said, extending his hand. "Harold Baker, your son was an excellent travel companion, bright, polite, and remarkably insightful for his age." Diana shook his hand, genuine appreciation in her eyes. "Diana Jefferson, thank you for keeping him company." "It was my pleasure," Harold assured her. "Though I must say, not everyone on the flight was as attentive to his needs as they should have been." Diana's expression shifted subtly as she looked from Harold to Marcus, who was now regarding Thomas Whitfield with curiosity. "Is that so?" Harold, noticing the shift in her demeanor and the presence of Thomas, who was clearly some kind of airline official, hesitated. "Perhaps it's not my place." "Please," Diana encouraged him. "I'd like to hear your perspective." Harold nodded, his expression growing serious. "One of the flight attendants, Stephanie, I believe her name was, repeatedly ignored your son's requests for water, 4 times by my count. It was only after I intervened that he was served, and even then the service was, notably lacking in courtesy." Thomas Whitfield's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between Diana and Harold. I assure you this is not representative of Meridian's service standards." "Isn't it?" Diana challenged softly, her hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Because this is precisely what happened 6 years ago on another of your flights, Mr. Whitfield. Except that time when my son persisted in asking for basic service, he was labeled disruptive, and we were both removed from the flight." Harold's eyebrows rose in surprise, and Marcus looked up at his mother, confusion evident on his face. "Mom, do you know this man?" Diana smiled down at her son, then looked back at Thomas. "Yes, Marcus, Mr. Whitfield is the CEO of Meridian Airlines, or rather he was." She extended her hand to Thomas, who shook it automatically, clearly stunned. "Thomas, I don't believe I properly introduced myself earlier. Diana Jefferson, CEO of Jefferson Capital, and as of 10:30 this morning, the new owner of Meridian Airlines." The color drained completely from Thomas's face. I didn't realize." "No," Diana agreed, her tone now pure business. "You didn't. But moving forward, I expect everyone at Meridian will realize that treating all passengers with dignity and respect isn't just the right thing to do. It's company policy, enforced from the top down." Harold watched this exchange with growing amazement, while Marcus looked up at his mother with a mixture of surprise and dawning understanding. "You bought the airline?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Diana knelt to meet her son's eyes. I did, and do you know why? Marcus thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Because knowledge is power. But understanding is freedom, Diana finished with a smile, standing to face Thomas again. Mr. Whitfield, I'll expect you at tomorrow's board meeting, where we'll discuss the future direction of Meridian. For now, I'd like to speak with the flight crew of this aircraft, particularly the flight attendant named Stephanie. Thomas, still visibly shaken, nodded. Of course, I'll arrange it immediately. As Thomas hurried away to make the arrangements, Harold chuckled softly. Well, this is certainly turning out to be a more interesting flight than I anticipated. Diana turned to him, her expression warming. Mr. Baker, thank you for looking out for my son. It means more than you know. Please call me Harold, he insisted. And no thanks necessary. I simply did what anyone should do when they see someone being treated unfairly. If only that were true, Diana said, a hint of sadness in her voice. But too often people look away, convince themselves they didn't see what they saw. Harold nodded in understanding. True enough, but change happens one person, one action at a time. He glanced at Marcus with a smile. And raising young men like your son to understand these issues, that's how real change begins. Diana's phone buzzed again with a message. The flight crew will meet us in the VIP lounge, she informed them. Harold, would you care to join us? I have a feeling your perspective would be valuable. Harold considered the invitation, then nodded. I'd be honored, though I'm merely an observer in all this. Sometimes, Diana replied as they began walking toward the lounge. Observers are exactly what we need to help us see the truth more clearly. As they walked through the bustling terminal, Marcus slipped his hand into his mother's, a gesture he had recently claimed to have outgrown. Diana squeezed it gently, recognizing the significance of the moment they were sharing. Mom, Marcus said quietly, are you going to get Stephanie in trouble? Diana looked down at her son, considering his question carefully. That depends, Marcus. Do you think she should be? Marcus was silent for a long moment, thinking deeply. I think she should understand what she did wrong, but maybe she needs to learn, not just be punished. Diana felt a surge of pride at her son's compassion and wisdom. That's a very mature perspective, and as it happens, I agree. Real change isn't about punishment, it's about education and accountability. As they approached the VIP lounge, Diana knew that what happened next would set the tone not just for her ownership of Meridian, but for the message she wanted to send to her son about how to address injustice with both strength and grace. It was a lesson more valuable than any business acquisition could ever be. The VIP lounge was hushed and elegant, with soft lighting and comfortable seating arranged for privacy. As Diana, Marcus, and Harold were escorted inside by an airline representative, they found 3 flight attendants already waiting, Stephanie looking tense and defensive, Raj, whose expression was serious but composed, and Kelly, who seemed concerned but resolute. Thomas Whitfield stood near them, his earlier confidence now completely eroded. He stepped forward awkwardly as they entered. Ms. Jefferson, this is the flight crew you requested to meet with. Diana nodded coolly, then turned to Marcus. Sweetheart, would you mind sitting over there for a few minutes while I speak with these people? She gestured to a comfortable seating area across the lounge, where a staff member had already set out water and snacks. Marcus glanced at the flight attendants, his eyes lingering briefly on Stephanie, who wouldn't meet his gaze. Okay, Mom, he agreed, moving to the indicated area but clearly remaining attentive to what was happening. Once Marcus was settled, Diana faced the flight crew, her posture straight and commanding, but her voice measured. I understand there was an issue with service on today's flight from Chicago. I'd like to hear from each of you about what occurred. Silence hung in the air for a moment before Kelly stepped forward. Ms. Jefferson, if I may, she began, her voice professional but tinged with regret. I was working the main cabin during this flight, but I became aware that there was a situation in first class regarding service to your son. Diana nodded for her to continue. Stephanie mentioned to me that there was a child traveling alone who she felt was being. Kelly hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Demanding. I asked if he needed assistance, and she said she had the situation under control. It wasn't until later, when Raj expressed concerns, that I realized there might be more to the story. Diana turned to Raj, who straightened under her gaze. I observed that the young passenger had pressed his call button several times without receiving service, Raj explained. When I inquired, Stephanie indicated that she was busy with other passengers. After Mr. Baker intervened, he nodded toward Harold, I took it upon myself to check on your son regularly for the remainder of the flight. Finally, Diana's gaze settled on Stephanie, whose face was now flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. And you, Ms. Winters, what's your account of what happened today? Stephanie shifted uncomfortably. I was attending to multiple passengers in first class. The boy, your son, kept pressing his call button. I acknowledged him several times, but there were other demands on my attention. 4 times? Harold interjected quietly but firmly. He pressed the call button 4 times over nearly an hour, asking only for water, which was not provided until I intervened. Meanwhile, you promptly served other passengers who requested your attention after he did. Stephanie's flush deepened. I was planning to get back to him. I didn't realize he was so thirsty. Didn't you? Diana asked, her voice level but penetrating. Or did you make assumptions about my son's presence in first class, about his right to be there to receive the same service as other passengers? The flight attendant's silence was answer enough. Diana turned to address all 3 crew members. I'm sure you're wondering why I've arranged this meeting. The simple answer is that, as of this morning, I am the new owner of Meridian Airlines. Stephanie's eyes widened in shock, while Raj and Kelly exchanged alarmed glances. But the more complex answer, Diana continued, is that 6 years ago my son and I were removed from a Meridian flight because a flight attendant decided that a black child asking repeatedly for water was being disruptive. When I filed a complaint, I received a form letter. When I escalated the issue, I was told that the crew's assessment of disruptive behavior was final. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. I promised myself then that if I ever had the opportunity to ensure no other child experienced that kind of dismissal and humiliation, I would take it. Today, that opportunity arrived, and it seems not a moment too soon. Thomas Whitfield, who had remained silent, now spoke up, his voice strained with forced professionalism. Ms. Jefferson, I want to assure you that this incident will be addressed immediately, with appropriate disciplinary. Diana held up a hand, silencing him. Mr. Whitfield, your approach, jumping immediately to discipline without understanding or addressing the root cause, is precisely why these issues persist at Meridian. She turned back to the flight crew. I'm not here to fire anyone today. I'm here to establish a new standard. She approached Stephanie directly, her gaze unwavering. Ms. Winters, I'd like you to tell me honestly, why did you ignore my son's requests for water? If you're watching this video from somewhere in the world right now, we'd love to hear your thoughts on how bias affects our daily interactions and what we can do to address it. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share in the comments where you're watching from. We're working to build a community where these important conversations can flourish. Stephanie swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Marcus, who was watching the exchange intently from across the room. I assumed he was bothering me unnecessarily. That maybe his parents had put him in first class but hadn't taught him the proper etiquette. Based on what evidence? Diana pressed. I don't know, Stephanie admitted, her voice barely audible. His age, maybe, the fact that he was alone. Nothing else. Diana's tone made it clear she wasn't going to accept evasion. After a long moment, Stephanie's shoulders sagged. Maybe his race played a part in my assumptions. I didn't think about it consciously, but... Diana nodded, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement of the honest answer. That awareness is the beginning of change, Ms. Winters. Unconscious bias shapes our actions in ways we often don't recognize until we're forced to examine them. She turned to address all 3 flight attendants and Thomas. Starting tomorrow, Meridian will be implementing mandatory training on unconscious bias for all staff, not as punishment but as education, because we can't change what we don't acknowledge. Kelly and Raj nodded in agreement, while Stephanie looked down at her hands. Additionally, Diana continued, we'll be revising the customer complaint system to ensure that concerns about discriminatory treatment receive proper attention and follow-up, and we'll be establishing clear metrics to track improvement. Thomas cleared his throat. That sounds expensive. Diana's gaze hardened as she turned to him. Not nearly as expensive as the lawsuit I could have filed 6 years ago, Mr. Whitfield, or as costly as continuing to alienate passengers through discriminatory treatment. Her tone left no room for further objection. Turning back to Stephanie, Diana's expression softened slightly. Ms. Winters, I believe in second chances and in learning from mistakes. So does my son, who suggested that education might be more valuable than punishment in this situation. She gestured for Marcus to join them. As Marcus approached, Stephanie looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just a black child in first class, but a thoughtful young person who, despite being treated poorly, had advocated for her learning rather than her dismissal. Marcus, Diana said gently, is there anything you'd like to say to Ms. Winters? Marcus looked up at the flight attendant, his expression serious beyond his years. I just wanted some water, he said simply, and to be seen like everybody else. The simplicity and dignity of his statement hung in the air, more powerful than any accusation could have been. Stephanie's composure finally broke. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't see you clearly, and that's not your fault, it's mine. Marcus nodded, accepting her apology with a maturity that moved everyone in the room. Diana placed a hand on her son's shoulder, pride evident in her eyes. This is how change begins, she said to everyone present, with acknowledgement, with honesty, and with the courage to do better. She looked specifically at Raj and Kelly. And it also requires allies who are willing to speak up when they see something wrong. Harold, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward. If I may add something, Ms. Jefferson. Diana nodded, inviting his contribution. In my 70 years, I've seen a lot of change, some of it good, some of it merely cosmetic. Real change requires not just policies and training, but a fundamental shift in how we see each other. He looked kindly at Stephanie. The hardest person to see clearly is often yourself. Recognizing your own biases is painful but necessary work. Stephanie nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. Diana turned to Thomas one final time. Mr. Whitfield, I'll see you at tomorrow's board meeting. Please have your team prepare a complete overview of Meridian's current diversity initiatives and customer complaint procedures. We have a lot of work to do. Thomas, now fully comprehending the scope of the changes coming to his company, nodded stiffly. Yes, Ms. Jefferson. As the meeting concluded and the flight crew prepared to leave, Diana extended her hand to each of them, including Stephanie. Thank you for your honesty today. It's the foundation upon which we'll build a better airline. After they had gone, only Diana, Marcus, and Harold remained in the lounge. Harold smiled warmly at both of them. That was quite something to witness, Ms. Jefferson. You handled it with remarkable grace and effectiveness. Thank you, Harold, and please call me Diana. Well, Diana, you've given me hope that real change is possible, even in institutions that have been resistant to it. Diana looked down at Marcus, who seemed tired but satisfied with how things had been resolved. It's for him, she said softly. Everything I do is to create a world where he doesn't have to fight quite so hard to be seen. Harold nodded in understanding. The best legacy we can leave. He picked up his bag, preparing to leave. I should be on my way, but it's been a privilege to meet you both. Actually, Diana said, if you don't have immediate plans, we'd love for you to join us for dinner. I think Marcus and I both could use some good company after such an eventful day. Harold's face lit up with pleasure. I'd be delighted. As they walked out of the airport together, an unlikely trio brought together by circumstance, but now connected by something deeper, Diana reflected on the day's events. She had acquired an airline, confronted discrimination head-on, and initiated changes that would impact thousands of employees and millions of passengers. But perhaps most importantly, she had shown her son that standing up for justice didn't always require anger or retribution. Sometimes, it simply required the courage to insist on being seen. 6 months later, Diana stood at the podium in Meridian's corporate headquarters, addressing the assembled staff and press. The company's transformation had been swift and substantive. New training programs, revised service standards, a completely overhauled customer feedback system, and a leadership team that now reflected the diversity of the passengers they served. Behind her on stage sat Marcus, now 11, alongside Harold Baker, who had become both a friend and an advisor to Meridian's newly formed passenger advocacy board. And somewhat surprisingly, Stephanie Winters was there too, now serving as a trainer in the company's bias awareness program, using her own experience as a powerful teaching tool. 6 months ago, I became the owner of this airline with a single goal: to create a company where every passenger is seen, heard, and treated with dignity, Diana began. Today, I'm proud to announce that complaints about discriminatory treatment have decreased by 78%, while our customer satisfaction scores have reached their highest level in company history. Applause filled the room, but Diana raised her hand for quiet. This isn't just about numbers, it's about people. It's about understanding that true service means seeing each person as an individual worthy of respect, regardless of age, race, gender, or any other characteristic. She looked back at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging smile. My son taught me that real change isn't about punishment, it's about growth, and every member of the Meridian family has embraced that growth in remarkable ways. As the applause resumed, Diana's mind flashed back to that moment 6 years ago when she and Marcus had been escorted off a Meridian flight, humiliated and angry. She could never have imagined then that their experience would lead to this day to substantive change that would impact countless travelers. After the presentation, as guests mingled at the reception, Stephanie approached Diana and Marcus somewhat tentatively. I wanted to thank you both again, she said, her demeanor markedly different from their first encounter, more open, more thoughtful. This program, it's changed how I see everything, not just at work but everywhere. Marcus smiled up at her. That's what Mom always says about understanding. Once you have it, you can't go back to not seeing. Stephanie nodded, clearly moved by his wisdom. Exactly, and I'm grateful for that, even though getting here wasn't easy. Diana observed this exchange with satisfaction, knowing that this, even more than the improved metrics or corporate accolades, was the real measure of their success. One person at a time, learning to see more clearly. As Stephanie moved away to speak with other guests, Harold joined Diana and Marcus, his eyes twinkling with appreciation of the moment. You've accomplished something remarkable here, Diana, not just changing policies, but changing hearts and minds. Diana shook her head slightly. It's a start. There's still so much work to do. There always will be, Harold agreed, but today we celebrate progress. He turned to Marcus. And you, young man, I hear you took first place at the regional debate tournament last week. Marcus grinned proudly. Yes, sir, the topic was corporate social responsibility. I can't imagine where you got your inspiration for that, Harold chuckled, sharing a knowing look with Diana. As they continued their conversation, Diana found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. What had begun as a personal quest for accountability had evolved into something much larger, a movement for change within an entire organization, touching thousands of lives in ways both small and profound. She thought about the water that Marcus had been denied, such a simple request that represented so much more. And she thought about the ripples that spread outward from that moment, ripples that had ultimately transformed not just an airline, but the people within it, including herself. In the end, it wasn't about ownership or power. It was about vision, the ability to see beyond what is to what could be, and the courage to bridge the gap between the two. Diana had bought an airline, but what she'd really acquired was an opportunity to show her son, and the world, that when people truly see each other, remarkable change becomes possible. And that, she realized as she looked at Marcus standing tall and confident beside her, was the greatest acquisition of all.